Mr. President-elect, you have 1 year. That's it. You have 1 year to unite the country and lead us forward. You think you've done this before. You've led a business, you created a campaign and beat the odds, but I can assure you that nothing will prepare you for the job you are about to begin. Lyndon Johnson, president 50 years ago, said it best: you have 1 year before the Congress stops thinking about you and starts thinking about their own re-election. You're taking over the largest corporation in the world, 4 million employees, 1.5 million men and women in uniform. But don't trust me, trust the man who preceded Johnson, who was president when you were in high school.
I would say that the problems are more difficult than I imagined them to be. The responsibilities placed in the United States are greater than I imagined them to be, and there are greater limitations upon our ability to bring about a favorable result than I had imagined them to be.
The problems are greater, the responsibility are greater, and your power is more limited than you think. What are the dimensions of your power as you try to lead the country and unify us, as you try to live up that vote of confidence that President Obama gave to you yesterday? There are 5 dimensions of presidential power, things that you can control. I'm going to walk through the lessons of history that my colleagues and I at the Miller Center have been working on based on the work that we do in recording the oral histories of presidents and listening to the private recordings of President Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. The first and most important are the people that surround you. Personnel. This gentleman's name is Al Haig. On paper, he was a spectacularly well-qualified Secretary of State, a 4-star general who had already served as White House Chief of Staff under Gerald Ford. This photograph was taken on May 30th, President Reagan's 69th day in office. President Reagan was at George Washington University Hospital. He had just been shot. In the confusion that followed at the White House, Al Haig took the podium and said that at this moment, I am in control here at the White House. There's a problem. The Secretary of State is not in control. The Vice President of the United States is. He went on to clarify that, but the damage had already been done. And what that said was that this man really wanted to be President of the United States and thought himself capable of doing that. There's another model as you build your national security team, easily the biggest responsibility you have in the days ahead. And that's this gentleman, Sandy Berger. He was the national security advisor I worked for. President Clinton offered him the job, and he said no. He served as deputy national security advisor for 4 years. And then successfully for 4 more years served as national security advisor. When President Clinton didn't have a strategic vision on an issue, he turned to Sandy Berger, who quietly whispered in his ear and never took credit for it. Okay, you've put your team together. Now you have to have a process. Who's in charge? How does it work? You can put the best team in the world together, and they can still screw things up. This is George H.W. Bush and his national security team. He was on paper the most qualified person to take the job in the history of the country. He had been vice president for 8 years. He had been ambassador to the United Nations, ambassador to China, and head of the Republican National Party. His team was also exceptional. James Baker, the man sitting to his left, had already been Secretary of the Treasury and White House Chief of Staff. He was now the Secretary of State. Dick Cheney had already been White House Chief of Staff and a senior member of Congress. He was now the Secretary of Defense. Brent Scowcroft had already been National Security Advisor. He came back as National Security Advisor. Colin Powell, a 4-star general. John Sununu, the Chief of Staff who had been a governor. presented with a crisis on October 1st, 1989, about 250 days into office, they failed. The crisis was in Panama, where the US had very important security concerns because we controlled the Panama Canal or had military installations there. The head of Panama was a dictator named Manuel Noriega, who we already were trying to get out of power because we had a federal indictment against him on drug trafficking charges. One of General Noriega's lieutenants let the United States know that he was going to try to overthrow him, something that we seem to have been calling for. Yet this team didn't respond with clarity. Different members of the team had different responses, and as the coup unfolded, we not only failed to achieve the priority, which was getting Manuel Noriega out of power, but sent uncertainty to our allies and partners around the world for what we stood for. But they learned from that mistake, and it was critical that they did so, because less than 2 months later, this happened. The Berlin Wall fell. And the team, having to face an internal crisis in another country, learned from their mistakes. They consulted amongst one another, they made no public statements, and they worked with allies and partners, including in Russia, to help bring to a peaceful resolution the Cold War. From failure, you can have success, but you have to have a sound process. You also have to know your priorities. It's interesting to bring priorities after personnel and process, but unless you have people you trust, you can't achieve anything that you want to achieve. Remember why you got elected. You were elected to bring economic growth back to America. So was Bill Clinton, the man whose wife you just defeated. These two gentlemen are George Stephanopoulos and Jim Carville. They famously coined the phrase for then Governor Clinton, "It's the economy, stupid." And that's how he won office. They campaigned relentlessly on that topic for a year, and they were preparing an agenda to come into office to follow through on that priority. Yet in President Clinton's first press conference, he chose to focus on an issue that was not part of his election strategy. It was an issue he had raised during the campaign, but it was not ultimately why he got elected. And the issue was bringing gays to the military. President Clinton famously said everyone should be able to serve. But the problem was that because that was not his campaign priority and his governing priority, he had not assembled a team and he had not assembled a process to carry through on that priority. And he spent the first 9 months in office trying to untangle a mess that he stepped into because he had lost sight of why he had been elected. That speaks to the next challenge. Here is an example of how you can succeed in your priority. And that's George W. Bush, a man that you have run against as a Republican. This is a day that very few people will forget. If you remember this photo, it was when Andy Card, his chief of staff, was telling President Bush that America was under attack. 2 planes had just flown into the World Trade Center in New York, and President Bush was speaking at a school in Florida. Up till this point, that was not his priority. His priority was compassionate conservatism, in particular reforming America's schools. That's why he was speaking to that school in Florida. And despite the crisis of 9/11, despite having to respond to that, he never lost sight of his priority. In fact, he started working on it now. In the days after he was elected, he pulled the gentlemen behind him, Democratic and Republican members of Congress, to the White House and started talking to them about how they were going to work together to pass legislation to start fixing America's school. And within 1 year, he had accomplished No Child Left Behind. What both of these stories, the failure of the Clinton administration and the success of the Bush administration, tell us is, once you've identified your priority, focus on the politics. Bring together members of Congress from both parties to solve the challenge. You have just been elected with big majorities in the House of Representatives and a narrow majority in the Senate. Don't let that make you believe that this is going to be easy. In this photo, we see Jimmy Carter and Tip O'Neill. Jimmy Carter told the Miller Center in his oral history, "My biggest mistake was by being elected without the support and help of people in Congress. I could do this by myself. I didn't have those relationships, and I didn't have a strategy for how to pull them together." And he had different views on, listen to the issues, jobs, energy reform, tax reform. He had different views than Tip O'Neill on that subject, a member of his own party who headed the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House. And on those three main challenges, President Carter failed in his first year to accomplish what he wanted to, and was limited in the years after that. There is a model for success, which is Lyndon Johnson, who famously said, "You have 1 year." This is the signing of the Civil Rights Act. In 1964, less than 1 year after President Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon Johnson worked with members of Congress from both houses and both political parties and put together a coalition to pass one of the most significant laws in American history. Finally, there's the personal. Nothing has prepared you for the previous 4 dimensions of power, but I can assure you nothing will prepare you for the scrutiny that you are about to have cast upon you. Every waking moment, whether in public or in private, people will scrutinize every move you make, every decision you make. And they will talk about it. No meeting is private. Everything is discussed. And not just what happens and what you say, but what you wear, what you do. You, Mr. President-elect, are good at branding. Every article of clothing you wear, every gesture you make will be scrutinized for what it says, what it communicates. In this picture, President Clinton and his Vice President Al Gore are wearing a hat that says one thing, a shirt that says another thing, and President Clinton has his iconic McDonald's cup that says a third thing. And of course, on Saturday Night Live, they get it. And they've gotten you already, and they're going to continue to focus, and they'll get it again. For those of you that don't remember Saturday Night Live from 24 years ago, that was the characterization of Bill Clinton. Notice he has his Georgetown hat, his Arkansas sweatshirt on. There's another model, a president that you seem to revere, President Reagan. Notice the message is clear and direct and simple. He's not just the kind of president that he wants to be, he's the kind of president that he thinks all Americans want to have. But there's another dimension of the personal that is as important. It's not just what you say, but how you communicate and listen. And Thomas Jefferson set this standard. This is Thomas Jefferson's dining room at Monticello. We know from history that he had a similar dining room at the White House. And he became famous in a very tense political time in bringing people around the table from his party, from the other party, and then eventually both parties together to listen to what was on their mind and to develop ideas together. We've talked about these 5 dimensions of power, but remember, power is not authority. Power is what you have control over. Authority and legitimacy comes from what other people have to say and how they respond to what you do. Let's talk about success. There are 2 models for success. Success in 1 year, passing your agenda like Lyndon Johnson said, and success in the 4 years of your presidency. Success in 1 year is Lyndon Johnson's second first year. After winning re-election in 1964, he passed massive legislation in 1965, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare and Medicaid, an immigration bill. That's him at the Statue of Liberty pushing that forward. He knew that he had limited political time. But he also made a mistake because after that, he never again passed a significant piece of legislation with either House of Congress. This is President Obama signing the Affordable Care Act into law, a significant first-year accomplishment, but it did not lead to subsequent accomplishments after that. after he passed a law with exclusively Democratic support, Republicans decided that they weren't going to work with him. There's a different model, which was President Clinton's model. This is President Clinton signing into law NAFTA, a treaty you ran against. But notice who's standing behind him. Republican and Democratic members of Congress, former presidents, Republican and Democratic. Mr. President-elect, if you are going to take on trade as an issue, you have to work with people from both parties, including your predecessor, if you're going to have authority, not just power. I want to leave you with one thought, back to Thomas Jefferson. When Thomas Jefferson won the famous election of 1800, a revolution he called it, and took power in 1801, it was the first transfer of power from one party to another ever in human history. There was fear in the United States. The French Revolution had happened just a few years before. That was a transfer of power from one party to another, but it was not peaceful. And Jefferson had praised that revolution. And the Federalists were concerned that Jefferson was going to be an American Jacobin, that he was going to start persecuting his enemies. Jefferson and his Republican allies feared that the Federalists were not going to give up power, that they were elitists, that they only cared about international business, that they didn't care about the American people. And everyone feared we were going to be drawn into a war between France and Britain. Jefferson immediately came out in his first address to the nation and said, "We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans." He built a team. He built a process. He established his priorities, one of which was staying out of the war in Europe and creating a great country. He made America great the first time with the Louisiana Purchase. He got the politics right, and he carried himself with dignity. Mr. President-elect, good luck.
Stay with me for just a minute. So, the work that you all are doing at the Miller Center is fantastic, really great. So I've got a quick question because I think the audience might want to know this. Most of us were surprised by the results of this election. You've been working on this talk for a long time. How would this talk have been different? Would it have been different?
Well, we would have started with a different picture.
Yeah.
The takeoff and the landing would have been different. I think had it been President-elect Clinton, the great fear there actually was that she thinks she's done the job before.
Yeah.
I think, and the landing is different as well. It's not a transfer of power from one party to the other. How would she have separated herself and distinguished herself from the party before her? And the challenge of winning 2 terms from the same party twice hasn't happened since Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. It's a moment of change in the country. I think what we have found in our conversations with the Trump transition, which has been in formation for 2 or 3 months, is that they're aware of how, the transition team is aware of how complex the challenges are, and that they're going to have to get up to speed very quickly. And I think we all have a stake in getting that right.
Well, thanks for your help making it happen.